I woke up one morning, looked at my baby, and thought, this isn't my daughter. Then the guilt hit me like a truck. I was terrified I'd become a monster. It's hard to admit this, but I can't keep it in anymore. 5 months ago, I, 23F, gave birth to my beautiful baby girl. She wasn't planned. She was the result of something I wouldn't wish on anyone. In 2023, I was assaulted by someone I thought was a friend. It shattered me. I cut all ties with him and anyone connected to him, moved away, and started therapy to try to piece myself back together. When I found out I was pregnant, I wrestled with the decision. People told me I didn't have to keep her, that it wasn't my responsibility to bring a child into the world under such awful circumstances. But it wasn't her fault. She was innocent, and I couldn't bear the thought of her growing up in the system. So, I kept her. The first few months were hard, but I loved her more than I thought possible. She's my little girl, my light in everything dark I've been through. My parents live nearby, and my younger sister's been a big help, too. It wasn't perfect, but we were making it work. At least, until this week. It started on Thursday morning. I woke up like any other day, glanced at her in her bassinet, and felt my heart stop. She wasn't my baby. Or at least, she didn't look like my baby. It's hard to explain, like someone had swapped her for another baby overnight. I stared at her, panicked, flipping through pictures on my phone. The more I looked, the more I felt trapped in some awful dream. Then, as quickly as the feeling had come, it was gone. She was my baby again, my sweet, smiling little girl. I told myself it was stress. I hadn't been sleeping much, and being a new mom is overwhelming for anyone, let alone someone with my history. But the fear stayed with me all day, like a shadow I couldn't shake. And then it happened again. I was feeding her when this wave of dread hit me. It was worse this time. Every instinct screamed at me to put her down and walk away. I wanted to reject her, my own daughter. She started crying, and instead of feeling that protective urgency to comfort her, all I felt was nothing. I powered through it, though. I fed her, held her, told her I loved her, even though my heart was racing and my brain felt like it was working against me. But inside, I was falling apart. How could I feel this way about her? What kind of mother thinks these things? I called my mom, barely able to get the words out. Please, can you take her? Just until I can see my therapist? She came right away, and I handed her over, guilt eating me alive. I've been counting down the hours until Monday when I can finally talk to my therapist. In the meantime, I'm stuck replaying it all, wondering what's wrong with me. Am I broken? Is this some kind of delayed reaction to the trauma I thought I was managing? Or worse, what if I'm not cut out to be her mom? I've heard of postpartum depression, but this feels different. It's not sadness. It's this terrifying sense of detachment, like a stranger is hijacking my mind and making me feel things I don't want to feel. I adore my daughter. I know I do. But in those moments, it's like my brain forgets that. And it scares me more than anything. I just had to get this out. Maybe someone out there has felt the same way and can tell me I'm not alone. Or maybe not. Either way, I just needed to say it. Update 1. I don't even know how to describe what happened at my therapist's office today. It wasn't the relief I was hoping for, but it wasn't the total disaster I feared either. I walked in expecting to get hit with some kind of label, something like, you're unfit to be a mother, or, you're just not mentally stable enough to raise a child. Instead, I got something else entirely. After I explained everything, every terrifying thought, every moment where it felt like I didn't even recognize my own baby, my therapist didn't flinch. She didn't look shocked or horrified, which made me feel a little less like a monster. She asked a ton of questions, though. Things like, how often do these episodes happen? What were you feeling right before they started? What's your sleep schedule like? How are you eating? Have you been having thoughts about harming yourself or others? That last one hit me like a brick. I didn't know how to answer at first because, no, I haven't had those thoughts exactly. But isn't rejecting my baby kind of the same thing? I told her that, and she said no, it's not the same at all. She explained that what I'm experiencing could be postpartum depression, but it also sounded a lot like something called postpartum depersonalization/derealization. It's basically when your mind dissociates because it's overwhelmed. For me, it's probably a mix of the physical toll of having a baby, sleep deprivation, and the trauma I'm still working through. She said it's like my brain's way of protecting me from emotions that feel too big to handle all at once, but it's not a perfect system, so it ends up creating this weird, terrifying disconnect instead. That was a lot to process. I mean, it kind of made sense. When I think about the moments where I've felt like my baby wasn't mine, it's like I was watching everything from outside my own body. Like I was a spectator in my own life. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized it's not just about my baby. Sometimes I feel that way about myself too, like I'm not even real. But here's the part that really shook me. My therapist said that while postpartum depression and dissociation are fairly common, they're not something to just power through. She said it's like trying to walk on a broken leg without a cast. You might manage for a little while, but eventually, you're going to make things worse. She wants me to start medication, which I honestly wasn't expecting. I've never been on antidepressants before, and I've always been kind of scared of them. What if they make me feel numb? What if they mess with my ability to bond with my baby even more? My therapist reassured me that the goal isn't to make me feel numb. It's to stabilize my brain enough so that I can process what's happening without feeling like I'm drowning. She also said that the medication isn't a forever thing. It's just a tool to help me get through this rough patch. I told her I needed some time to think about it, and she said that's fine, but she really emphasized how important it is to address this sooner rather than later. We also talked a lot about my trauma from the assault. That part was hard. She pointed out that I've been trying to compartmentalize it, to shove it into this little box in my mind so I can pretend it's not affecting me. And yeah, that's exactly what I've been doing. I don't want my daughter to be tied to what happened to me, so I've been trying to separate the two as much as possible. But my therapist said that's not how trauma works. It doesn't just stay in its little box. It seeps into everything, whether I realize it or not. One thing she said that really stuck with me was, "You're not broken, but you are wounded, and wounds need care to heal." It's such a simple thing, but it hit me so hard. I've been walking around acting like I can handle everything on my own, like I'm supposed to just be fine because I made the choice to keep my baby. But the truth is, I'm not fine. And that's okay. It doesn't mean I'm a bad mom. It just means I'm human. After the session, I felt this weird mix of emotions. On one hand, I was relieved to finally have some kind of explanation for what's been happening. But on the other hand, I felt completely overwhelmed. There's no quick fix for this. Therapy is going to take time. The medication, if I decide to take it, might take weeks to start working. And in the meantime, I'm still going to have to deal with these terrifying moments where it feels like my own mind is betraying me. When I got home, my mom was still watching my baby. She asked how the session went, and I told her the basics. She's been really supportive, but I can tell she's worried. She keeps asking if I'm sure I can handle this, if maybe it would be better for her to take a more active role in raising my daughter. And as much as I appreciate her help, the thought of handing over that responsibility makes me feel like a failure. This is my baby. I chose to have her. I want to be the one to raise her. But then there's this little voice in the back of my mind that says, what if you can't? What if the medication doesn't work? What if the therapy isn't enough? What if I'm just not strong enough to do this? I keep going back to what my therapist said about wounds needing care. I know she's right, but it's hard not to feel guilty for needing that care in the first place. I look at my baby, and she's so perfect, so innocent, and I can't help but wonder if she deserves better than what I can give her right now. For now, I'm taking it one day at a time. My mom is going to keep helping out while I figure out my next steps. I've been writing down my thoughts whenever I feel overwhelmed, which my therapist suggested as a way to process things in between sessions. It helps a little, but there's still this huge part of me that just wants to fast forward to the part where everything's okay again. I don't know how long it's going to take to get there, but I'm trying to remind myself that progress isn't always linear. Some days are going to be harder than others, and that's just part of the process. It doesn't mean I'm failing. It just means I'm healing, even if it doesn't feel like it in the moment. And if anyone else out there is going through something similar, please know you're not alone. I don't have all the answers, but I do know this: asking for help doesn't make you weak. It makes you strong enough to admit that you can't do everything on your own, and that's okay. Update 2. This week was a mixed bag of emotions. There's progress, I think, but there are also setbacks that make me question everything. I started the medication my therapist prescribed, and let me tell you, the first few days felt like I'd made a huge mistake. I was nauseous, exhausted, and just overall off. It was like my body was fighting this new thing I was putting into it, and I couldn't tell if it was helping or making things worse. One night was especially bad. My daughter started crying at around 3 a.m., and I just sat there staring at the monitor, completely frozen. I couldn't bring myself to move. My brain kept saying, "Go, she needs you," but my body wasn't listening. The guilt was crushing. Eventually, I snapped out of it and went to her, but the whole time I felt like a failure. My mom ended up coming over the next morning to help because I was a wreck. Here's the thing, though, the meds aren't a magic fix, but I think they're starting to help, little by little. A few days after that awful night, I had this moment where I was feeding my daughter, and it didn't feel like a chore or an obligation. It felt normal. I looked at her tiny hands gripping the bottle, her little face so focused, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like I was watching it all from outside my body. I just was there, present. It was such a small thing, but it felt huge to me. Therapy has been another story. It's not easy to sit there and peel back the layers of everything I've been avoiding for so long. My therapist keeps gently pushing me to talk about the assault, even though I'd rather bury it and never think about it again. She says it's connected to how I'm feeling now, that the trauma is like this uninvited guest that keeps barging in and messing up my mental space. I hate it. I hate thinking about it, I hate talking about it, and I hate that it still has so much power over me. But deep down, I know she's right. Ignoring it hasn't worked so far, so maybe facing it head-on is the only way to start taking back control. One thing my therapist suggested was journaling. I was skeptical at first because, let's be real, writing out your feelings sounds like something from a cheesy self-help book. But I gave it a shot, and it's actually been kind of helpful. There's something cathartic about dumping all the messy, jumbled thoughts in my head onto a page. It's like clearing out mental clutter. Sometimes I write letters to my daughter, things I hope she'll understand when she's older, like how much I love her even on the days when my brain tries to convince me I'm not good enough. Speaking of my daughter, she's been hitting these little milestones lately, and it's wild how much it's both helping and overwhelming me. She's starting to smile more, and she even let out her first little giggle the other day. It was the sweetest sound, and I felt this wave of pride and love that almost knocked me over. But then there's this other part of me that panics, thinking, what if I'm not good enough for her? What if I mess her up somehow? It's like this constant tug-of-war between hope and fear. My mom has been a lifesaver through all of this. She comes over almost every day, even if it's just to give me a break so I can shower or nap. She keeps telling me I'm stronger than I think, but it's hard to believe her sometimes. I still catch myself wondering if I made the right decision by keeping my daughter. Don't get me wrong, I love her more than anything, but this is the hardest thing I've ever done, and there are moments where I'm not sure I'm cut out for it. There was one really bad moment this week that I'm still trying to process. My sister came over to visit, and we were sitting in the living room chatting while my daughter napped. Out of nowhere, she asked me if I ever think about giving her up for adoption. I don't think she meant it to be cruel, she was just being blunt in that way she always is, but it felt like a punch to the gut. I snapped at her and told her I would never do that, but later, I couldn't stop replaying her words in my head. What if she's right? What if my daughter would be better off with someone else? That question haunted me for days, but then something happened that gave me a little bit of clarity. My daughter was fussing, and I picked her up and started rocking her. She calmed down almost immediately and rested her head on my chest. In that moment, it hit me, I'm her mom. No one else is going to love her the way I do, even if I'm not perfect. She doesn't need me to be perfect, she just needs me to show up, to try, to love her the best I can. I've been holding on to that thought like a lifeline. It doesn't make everything better, but it helps when the doubt creeps in. My therapist keeps reminding me that healing isn't a straight line, and I'm starting to see what she means. Some days are better than others. Some moments feel like steps forward, while others feel like steps back. But the important thing is that I'm still moving. One thing I've learned this week is that it's okay to ask for help. That's been a hard lesson for me because I've always prided myself on being independent. But being a mom, especially under these circumstances, isn't something I can do alone, and that's not a failure. It's just reality. I'm also learning to give myself grace, which is easier said than done. There are still moments where I feel like I'm failing, like I'm not enough, but I'm trying to remind myself that feeling those things doesn't make them true. My therapist told me to imagine what I would say to a friend who was going through the same thing. I'd probably tell her she's doing an amazing job and that she's stronger than she thinks. So why is it so hard to say that to myself? For now, I'm focusing on the small wins. Like when my daughter giggles or falls asleep in my arms. Like when I make it through a day without feeling completely overwhelmed. Like when I manage to eat a real meal or take a shower. Those little things might not seem like much, but to me, they're proof that I'm still here, still trying. I don't know what the next week will bring, but I'm holding on to hope that it'll be a little better than this one. And if it's not, well, I'll keep trying anyway. Because that's what moms do, right?